There is something happening around you right now that you may be completely unaware of. Somewhere in your daily life, there could be a woman who has already decided that she likes you. Not maybe, not possibly. She has already reached that conclusion in her own mind. And the strange part is that she might have reached it long before you even started wondering whether she was interested. Most men imagine attraction as something that begins when they make a move. They think the story starts when they ask a woman out, when they say something charming, or when they finally gather enough courage to express their interest. But in many cases, the story actually begins much earlier, and it begins in her mind. Long before a man decides whether he likes a woman, she has often already been quietly evaluating him. She has been observing how he speaks, how he behaves around other people, how he reacts in certain situations. She notices the small things most men assume nobody is paying attention to, and while all of this is happening, she is forming a picture of what it might be like to be close to him. This is where many men misunderstand the dynamic between attraction and awareness. A woman rarely announces her interest in obvious ways. Instead, she communicates it through behavior, subtle patterns, and emotional signals that are easy to miss if you do not know what you are looking for. That is why so many men have experienced a strange moment, months or even years later, when they suddenly realize something that once seemed impossible. They look back at a woman from their past and think, wait, was she actually into me? Sometimes the realization comes when someone else points it out. Sometimes it appears later during a random conversation with a friend. And sometimes it happens when the opportunity has already passed and the woman has moved on. The difficult part about this situation is that the signals were there all along. They simply did not look like what most men expected. Attraction is not always loud. In fact, it is often quiet. It shows itself in small decisions, repeated actions, and subtle emotional investments that might seem ordinary if you do not recognize their meaning. A woman who feels drawn to a man does not always express it through direct statements. Instead, she begins to shape her behavior in ways that create opportunities for connection. She makes room for him in her attention, in her time, and sometimes even in her imagination. From the outside, these actions can appear harmless or even accidental. But when you understand the patterns behind them, they start to look very different. What once appeared to be coincidence becomes intention. What once looked like friendliness begins to reveal a deeper interest. And once you learn to recognize these patterns, you start seeing them everywhere. The truth is that many men walk past potential relationships simply because they never realized a woman had already opened the door. And the purpose of this conversation is to make sure that does not keep happening. Because once you understand the language behind these signals, you begin to see something most men completely miss. If you want to understand why so many men miss these signals, you first need to understand something important about how attraction actually begins. The common belief is that men initiate romance while women simply respond. Movies, television, and even traditional dating advice have repeated this idea for decades. The image most people grow up with is that a man approaches, a man makes the first move, and a woman either accepts or rejects him. But real human behavior tells a very different story. When researchers began studying how relationships actually start, they discovered that the majority of romantic interactions are not triggered by direct approaches at all. Instead, they begin with subtle invitations. These invitations are rarely verbal, and they often appear so ordinary that the person receiving them does not even realize what is happening. Several behavioral studies have shown that women frequently initiate romantic interaction through nonverbal signals long before a man ever thinks he is taking the lead. The signals may involve body language, attention patterns, or repeated presence in the same space. The key idea here is that attraction often begins as a silent process. A woman might notice a man in her environment and begin evaluating him without him realizing it. She watches how he treats people, she listens to the way he speaks, she notices whether he seems calm, confident, respectful, or emotionally steady. These observations help her decide whether he is someone she wants to know more about. During this stage, she is not necessarily planning a relationship yet. What she is doing is running what psychologists sometimes describe as a mental simulation. She imagines how it might feel to spend time with him, what conversations with him might be like, or how he might fit into her world. All of this can happen without a single romantic conversation, and that is why the signals that follow are often misunderstood. Once her mind begins leaning toward interest, her behavior shifts in small ways. She begins paying more attention to him than she does to others around her. She might notice details about him that she would normally ignore. She might remember things he said days or even weeks earlier. She might even begin arranging situations that increase the chances of interacting with him. None of this feels dramatic from the outside. It feels normal. It feels casual. Sometimes it even feels accidental. But from a psychological perspective, it is the beginning of attraction expressing itself through behavior. This is where the confusion begins for many men, because while she is sending signals, he may still be trying to figure out whether she even notices him. He might assume she is simply being polite, friendly, or sociable. Meanwhile, she is often waiting to see whether he will recognize the opportunity she is quietly presenting. This difference in perception creates one of the most common misunderstandings in dating. From his perspective, nothing obvious has happened yet. From her perspective, she has already shown interest several times and is waiting to see whether he will respond. Understanding this difference changes everything, because once you recognize that attraction often begins with silent signals rather than direct statements, you start paying attention to the behaviors that reveal what someone is actually feeling. And when you begin noticing those behaviors, you realize that the story of who initiates romance is not nearly as simple as most people believe. There is another part of this dynamic that many men never realize until it is too late. Attraction does not stay in the same place forever. When a woman begins signaling interest, she is not planning to send those signals indefinitely. There is often an invisible window of time where she is hoping the man she is interested in will notice and respond. If nothing happens during that time, something interesting begins to shift inside her mind. At first, she might assume you simply have not noticed yet. She might give you a little more time. She might even increase the clarity of her signals slightly. She might start conversations more often, laugh more easily around you, or place herself near you more frequently. But if the response never comes, her brain begins to interpret the silence differently. Instead of thinking maybe he hasn't noticed yet, she may start thinking maybe he isn't interested. And once that interpretation forms, her behavior slowly begins to change. This is something psychologists often refer to as emotional self-protection. When someone feels they may be investing attention in a person who does not return that interest, the mind begins creating distance as a way to avoid rejection or embarrassment. In practical terms, this means she may stop placing herself around you as often. She may stop initiating conversations. The playful attention she once gave you becomes neutral again. Eventually, she convinces herself that the interest she once felt was a mistake. From your perspective, it might look like nothing happened. From her perspective, an entire emotional story took place that you never saw. And that is why so many men later find themselves confused when they hear that a woman they once knew had feelings for them. They remember the friendly conversations and the shared moments, but never realize those moments carried deeper meaning. By the time they recognize it, the opportunity has often passed. This is exactly why learning to read these signals matters, because when you understand how attraction is expressed through behavior, you start seeing patterns that once looked invisible. By the way, if you're new here, my name is Isabella. On this channel, we talk about the psychology behind relationships, attraction, and the subtle signals people use to communicate interest without saying the words directly. And today, we are looking at 4 of the clearest signals a woman gives when she has already made up her mind about a man. These are not vague hints or confusing mixed messages. They are consistent behavioral patterns that show up again and again in real interactions. Once you learn to recognize them, you begin to see them everywhere. And the first sign is one that many men experience but completely misunderstand when it happens. Because when a woman is interested in you, one of the earliest things she begins to do is something that looks almost accidental on the surface. But once you understand the psychology behind it, it becomes impossible to miss. The first sign that a woman has already chosen you is something that looks completely ordinary. At first, in fact, most men dismiss it immediately because it does not feel dramatic or romantic. It simply feels like coincidence. She keeps showing up around you not once, not twice, but repeatedly. And the reasons she gives for being there often seem logical on the surface. Yet when you step back and really look at the pattern, the situation starts to feel a little strange. Because the truth is, her presence near you does not always make practical sense. Think about how people normally move through their day. Most of us choose the fastest route, the easiest option, and the path that requires the least effort. Human beings naturally try to conserve energy whenever possible. If something requires extra effort without a clear benefit, we usually avoid it. That is why repeated proximity can reveal something important. When a woman begins appearing around you in situations where she does not technically need to be there, it is often a signal that your presence has become emotionally valuable to her. Being near you feels rewarding enough that the inconvenience does not matter. This might look like small things at first. She suddenly chooses the same lunch area where you usually sit, even though there are several other places she could go. She walks past your workspace more often than necessary. She joins conversations you are part of even when she does not have a direct reason to participate. Sometimes she even creates a reason to talk to you. She might ask a question that could easily be answered somewhere else. She might bring up something small just to start a conversation. On the surface, it appears harmless, even random, but when the same pattern repeats again and again, the explanation becomes clearer. She is choosing proximity. Behavioral researchers who study attraction often observe what is called proximity-seeking behavior. When someone feels drawn to another person, their brain naturally encourages them to reduce physical distance. Being closer increases the chance of interaction, and interaction increases the chance of emotional connection. The interesting part is that many people do not consciously plan this behavior. A woman might genuinely believe she simply enjoys the environment where you happen to be. She might tell herself she likes the coffee machine on your floor or prefers the hallway where your office is located. Her mind provides perfectly reasonable explanations, but beneath those explanations, her behavior is still guided by attraction, and that is why this sign often confuses men. From your perspective, she might simply appear friendly or social. From her perspective, she is creating opportunities for you to notice and start a conversation. It is a subtle invitation, not a demand, not an obvious move, but an opening. And once you begin paying attention to patterns like this, you start recognizing when someone's presence in your world is not random at all. It is intentional, even if the intention is never spoken out loud. Now, here is the part most men completely misunderstand about that first sign. They assume that if a woman keeps showing up around them, it must just be coincidence. After all, people work in the same places, visit the same cafes, share the same social circles. It is easy to explain away repeated encounters as random overlap. But when researchers began studying human attraction in real environments, they discovered something fascinating. People who feel drawn to someone rarely stay neutral in physical space. Instead, they unconsciously adjust their movement patterns in order to increase the chance of contact. This behavior appears across workplaces, social events, university campuses, and even casual everyday. When attraction is present, distance slowly begins to shrink. Psychologists call this proximity seeking. The concept is simple. When someone becomes emotionally interested in another person, their brain begins nudging them towards situations where interaction could happen naturally. They do not always plan it consciously. Often it simply feels like a harmless decision in the moment. Maybe she chooses the seat closer to you during a meeting instead of the empty seat across the room. Maybe she walks past your desk even though there is another hallway that would get her to the same place faster. Maybe she finds reasons to join conversations where you are already present. Each individual action looks ordinary, but the pattern behind those actions tells a different story. When you start noticing the same person appearing in your environment again and again without a clear reason, the brain should begin asking a simple question. Why here and why this often? Because human beings rarely waste time and energy unless something matters to them. This does not mean she is calculating every movement like a strategy. Attraction is rarely that deliberate. What usually happens is far more instinctive. Being near someone we like simply feels good. It creates anticipation, curiosity, and a small emotional reward every time we interact. That reward encourages repetition, and over time, repetition creates opportunity. This is why the first sign becomes clearer the longer it continues. A single coincidence means nothing. 2. Coincidences might still be random, but when a woman repeatedly chooses spaces where interaction with you becomes possible, the explanation begins to shift. It is no longer just coincidence. It is attention. Another detail many men overlook is that these moments often come with subtle invitations. When she appears near you, she may glance in your direction slightly longer than necessary. She may pause long enough to create space for conversation. Sometimes she might even make a small comment simply to open the door for interaction. She is not forcing the situation. She is creating an opportunity. And in many cases, she is watching to see if you step into that opportunity, because from her perspective, she is already moved closer. She has already shown interest in the safest way she knows how. The next step in her mind often belongs to you. But proximity is only the beginning, because the second sign she gives you is much harder to explain away as coincidence once you see it happen. The second sign a woman has already chosen you is something that often surprises men because it appears so simple on the surface. It does not look dramatic. It does not look flirtatious. In fact, many men interpret it as nothing more than politeness. But once you understand the psychology behind it, it becomes one of the clearest signals you will ever see. She remembers small details about you that even you forgot sharing. Think about how human memory normally works. Every day we hear hundreds of pieces of information from different people. Most of those details disappear almost immediately because the brain filters out anything it considers unimportant. This is not a flaw in our memory system. It is actually how the brain protects itself from overload. We remember what matters to us emotionally. Everything else fades away. That is why this sign is so powerful. When a woman recalls something small that you mentioned casually days or even weeks earlier, she is revealing something about how her brain has categorized you. You are no longer background noise in her environment. You have become someone her mind considers important. Imagine a simple scenario. You mentioned in passing that you have a doctor's appointment coming up next week. It is one sentence in the middle of a conversation about something completely unrelated. You probably forget about that moment almost immediately. Then a week later she asks, "How did your appointment go?" That moment should make you pause because remembering something like that requires attention, and attention requires emotional interest. Without that interest, the brain simply does not store the information long enough to recall it later. Psychologists studying early-stage attraction often observe a pattern called selective attention. When someone becomes emotionally interested in another person, their brain begins prioritizing information connected to that individual. Details that would normally fade away suddenly become memorable. Your hobbies become memorable. Your favorite foods become memorable. Your schedule becomes memorable. Even random comments you make during casual conversations become memorable. This is not something she is doing as a strategy. Most of the time, she's not even aware that she is doing it. Her brain has simply decided that information about you is worth saving, and that decision changes the way she listens when you speak. Instead of half hearing your words the way people usually do in casual conversation, she is absorbing them. She is storing them. She is connecting them to future moments when she might bring them up again. From your perspective, this may feel like she is simply being attentive or thoughtful. From a psychological perspective, it is something deeper. Her attention is focused on you in a way that goes beyond ordinary interaction. And when someone consistently remembers the small details of your life, it means your presence has already taken up space in their mind. But this sign, powerful as it is, still involves quiet observation. The third sign is where things start becoming harder to hide because it reveals how she reacts when something threatens the attention she has already given you. The third sign that a woman has already chosen you often appears when another woman enters the picture. And this is where things become interesting because the reaction is rarely loud or dramatic. In fact, it is usually so subtle that many men overlook it completely. What you're looking for is a small shift in her behavior when she senses potential competition. Everything might seem normal at first. She is relaxed, easygoing, and comfortable around you. Conversations flow naturally. She behaves exactly the way she always does. Then another woman shows interest in you. Maybe a coworker stops by your desk and laughs a little too easily at your jokes. Maybe a female friend hugs you warmly when she arrives somewhere. Maybe you casually mention another woman during a conversation, and suddenly something changes. It might only last a few seconds. Her posture adjusts slightly. Her tone becomes a little more focused. She begins paying closer attention to what is happening around you. Sometimes she moves physically closer to you without realizing it. These reactions are often so subtle that they can easily be mistaken for nothing. But from a psychological perspective, they reveal something important. When a woman has already developed emotional interest in a man, her brain begins treating his attention as something valuable. Attention becomes a resource. And whenever a resource appears to be threatened, the brain responds instinctively. This response is not necessarily jealousy in the dramatic sense people often imagine. It is usually much quieter than that. It might show up as curiosity. She might ask a question that sounds casual but carries deeper meaning. Something like, "How do you know her?" Or, "Is she someone you work with?" The words themselves sound harmless, but the timing and tone behind them often reveal that she is gathering information. Another common reaction is a sudden increase in engagement. If another woman begins interacting with you, the woman who is interested may suddenly become more present in the conversation. She might contribute more actively, she might touch your arm while speaking, or laugh more openly than usual. These behaviors are not always conscious decisions. They often come from a part of the brain that reacts instinctively to perceived competition. Anthropologists and relationship researchers have long observed this pattern. When people form an emotional preference for someone, even in the early stages, they naturally become more attentive when another potential partner appears nearby. It is a quiet way of saying without words, "I am here." And the fascinating part is that many women will later deny doing this at all. Not because they are being dishonest, but because they were not consciously aware of it. The reaction happened automatically. Their mind had already categorized you as someone important. So, when the possibility of losing your attention appeared even briefly, their behavior adjusted in response. When you begin noticing this pattern, it becomes very difficult to ignore because it reveals something that friendliness alone rarely produces. It reveals emotional investment. To really understand why that reaction happens, you need to look at what attraction does inside the brain. Because when a woman begins developing feelings for someone, her mind does not treat that person the same way it treats everyone else in her environment. Something shifts neurologically. Researchers who study romantic attraction have found that the brain begins activating several systems at once. The reward system becomes more sensitive to that person's presence. The motivation system encourages attention toward them, and surprisingly, another system begins to wake up as well, one connected to protection and competition. This is not something people consciously decide to do. It is part of how human bonding works. When someone becomes emotionally important to us, our brain starts treating their attention as valuable, not in a selfish or possessive way, but in a protective way. The mind begins to monitor situations where that attention might shift toward someone else. And this is where subtle competition behavior can appear. It does not look like the exaggerated jealousy you sometimes see in movies. Instead, it shows up in small behavioral adjustments. A woman might suddenly become more attentive during a conversation. If another woman enters the interaction, she may begin engaging more actively, asking questions, maintaining stronger eye contact, or positioning herself physically closer to you. The interesting part is that these changes often disappear as quickly as they appeared. Once the perceived competition is gone, she returns to her usual relaxed behavior. This is why the moment can feel confusing if you are not paying attention. From your perspective, it might seem like she suddenly became more engaged and then just as suddenly relaxed again. But from a psychological standpoint, her brain was briefly responding to a situation where the attention she values could have shifted elsewhere. Anthropologists who study mating behavior across cultures often observe the same pattern. When attraction is present, people become more aware of potential rivals, even if they never openly acknowledge it. And again, this reaction is rarely deliberate. Most women are not thinking, "I need to compete right now." Their behavior simply adjusts automatically in response to the emotional value they have already placed on you. In fact, if you later asked her why she suddenly became more involved in the conversation, she might give you a completely logical explanation. She might say she just found the topic interesting or felt like contributing more in that moment, but the timing of the behavior often reveals something deeper.